The year was 1961. Vincent the Hammer Torino was laughing, not the nervous kind of laughter men use to fill silence in dangerous rooms. This was real laughter, the kind that comes from a man who genuinely believes he is untouchable. He was sitting at the head of a poker table in the private back room of Ralph's restaurant in East Harlem, surrounded by his soldiers, his money, and 20 years of accumulated arrogance. He controlled half the docks in Manhattan. He had judges in his pocket. He had politicians on his payroll. He had survived gang wars, federal investigations, and 3 separate attempts on his life. And now, he was looking across a green felt table at a man from Harlem, a man he had decided to humiliate, and he was laughing like nothing in the world could ever touch him. He was wrong. He just didn't know it yet, because the man sitting across from him, absorbing every insult with the stillness of deep water before a storm, had not come to that room to play cards. He had come to deliver a verdict. The trial had already happened. The sentence had already been decided. Vincent Torino was not watching a confrontation unfold. He was watching his own execution, dressed up as an evening of poker and whiskey, and the executioner was smiling. The executioner's name was Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, and what happened next would be talked about in back rooms across 3 continents for the next 60 years, not because of the violence, but because of the complete and total absence of it. Because Bumpy Johnson had long since learned something that men like Vincent Torino never figured out. The most devastating punishment you can deliver to a powerful man is not his death. It is his irrelevance. To understand what happened in that room, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of that night, but the beginning of the man. Bumpy Johnson did not become a legend by accident. He became a legend by design, by discipline, and by a code of honor he carried from the streets of Charleston, South Carolina, all the way to the highest levels of organized crime in New York City. Ellsworth Johnson was born in 1905 inches Charleston, and from his earliest years the world taught him the same lesson over and over, that his life, his dignity, his future were worth less than the comfort of men born with the right skin color. He watched his mother, Margaret Johnson, a woman of extraordinary grace and iron will, clean the houses of wealthy white families during the day and run numbers for local gangsters at night. She never complained. She never bent. And she raised her son with 2 principles burned so deep into his character that nothing, not prison, not betrayal, not the full weight of the American criminal justice system, could ever burn them out. Never forget where you come from, and never, under any circumstances, let anyone disrespect your family. Those 2 principles would become the architecture of everything Bumpy Johnson ever built, and they would become the foundation of what happened to Vincent Torino. Bumpy arrived in Harlem in 1930 with $47 and a mind that processed the world differently from almost everyone around him. While other young men from the streets saw obstacles, Bumpy saw patterns. While other operators reacted to threats, Bumpy anticipated them. While other gangsters built their power on fear generated in a single room on a single night, Bumpy was always thinking about the room 3 months from now, the conversation that hadn't happened yet, the move that would only make sense after 7 other moves had already been made. He didn't just learn the rules of Harlem. He learned the rules of the men who made the rules. He learned their weaknesses, their vanities, their private fears. He cultivated informants not through intimidation but through genuine loyalty. He paid attention to people that powerful men ignored entirely. The cleaning staff, the maintenance crews, the drivers, The invisible people who moved through every room in the city and were never once suspected of listening. By 1935, Bumpy Johnson was the most feared man in Harlem, not for his capacity for violence, though that capacity was real. He was feared for his mind. You could protect yourself against a man with a gun. You could not protect yourself against a man who already knew everything about you before you walked into the room. That was the man Vincent Torino decided to humiliate on a Tuesday night in 1961. Let's talk about Vincent Torino. Because you cannot understand what happened without understanding exactly who this man was and why he believed, with absolute sincerity, that he could do what he did and face no consequences. Vincent was old criminal money, which in the world of mid-century New York organized crime was essentially the same as old money in any other world. He had inherited his position in the Genovese family from a father who had built it through 3 decades of brutal efficiency. He had never had to earn respect the hard way. It had been handed to him along with territory, soldiers, and the comfortable conviction that a man in his position was simply not subject to the same rules as other men. Vincent ruled through humiliation as much as through fear. He had a gift for finding the precise thing that would make a man feel small and using it publicly, in front of witnesses, in ways that left permanent marks. He did this to everyone: business partners, rivals, even his own lieutenants when he felt they were getting too comfortable. In Vincent's world, keeping men off balance was a form of management. What Vincent failed to understand was that this strategy only works when the man you are humiliating has no real power of his own. It works on frightened men. It works on men who have something to lose. It does not work on a man who walked into the room already holding everything he needs to end you. The meeting at Ralph's restaurant had been requested by Bumpy through the usual channels, a sit-down, neutral territory. On the surface, it was about territory disputes. Vincent had agreed with the casual condescension of a man who sees such conversations as formalities. In his mind, there was nothing to negotiate. He arrived with 10 soldiers and an attitude that filled the room before his body did. Gold rings, pressed suit, the practiced confidence of a man who has never once worried about what happens next. Bumpy arrived alone, or appeared to. He sat across from Vincent with the stillness that his closest associates had learned to recognize as the most dangerous version of him, not the Bumpy who raised his voice. This was the Bumpy who had already made every decision that needed to be made. The Bumpy who was simply waiting for events to catch up with his plans. The early part of the evening was standard. Drinks, pleasantries that weren't really pleasant. The careful circling of men, deciding how much they need to perform respect before getting to the business of showing how little they actually feel. And then Vincent, emboldened by his whiskey and the presence of his men, decided to shift the temperature of the room. He started with Bumpy's business, called it small time, amateur, the work of a man who had gotten lucky in a neighborhood nobody important really cared about. Bumpy didn't react. He watched Vincent with those dark, steady eyes and said nothing. Encouraged by the silence, which he read as weakness, Vincent escalated. He made a comment about Bumpy's clothes, then about his reputation. Then, reaching for what he calculated would do the most damage, about Bumpy's mother, about Margaret Johnson, who had spent her life cleaning other people's houses and running numbers to keep her family alive, about a woman who had raised one of the most complex and brilliant men in the history of American organized crime, and who had no idea, sitting in her small Harlem apartment, that her name was being used as a weapon in a back room across town. What happened next was not what anyone expected. The other men at the table braced themselves, because in their world, what Vincent had just done was the kind of thing that ended in blood. Immediately, a man's mother was sacred ground. Crossing that line in front of witnesses wasn't just an insult. It was a declaration. And declarations required responses. Bumpy's response was a single finger, tapping once against the green felt of the table. Just once. The sound was barely audible. It might as well have been a gavel. He reached into his jacket, not for a weapon, for a photograph. Old, worn at the edges, the image slightly faded with age. His mother, standing outside their apartment in Charleston, holding young Ellsworth's hand. He placed it on the table in front of him. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Vincent, and he smiled. Not the smile of a man performing composure, the smile of a man who had just received confirmation of something he already knew. "Tell me, Vincent," Bumpy said. His voice was so calm that the men at the table leaned forward involuntarily, straining to hear it. "What do you know about respect?" Vincent laughed. The sound was a little too loud, a little too forced. Somewhere beneath the arrogance, his nervous system was registering something that his conscious mind refused to acknowledge. Something in this room was wrong. "I know enough to recognize when someone doesn't deserve it," Vincent said, gesturing dismissively at Bumpy. "You Harlem boys think you run something, but you're just playing dress-up in suits your betters threw away." Bumpy folded the photograph carefully and returned it to his jacket pocket, right next to his heart. Then he stood, slowly, with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has nowhere to be because he already is exactly where he planned to be. "Vincent," he said. The word carried the quiet authority of an absolute verdict. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Vincent's laughter continued. His men joined in, and in the middle of all that noise, Bumpy stood perfectly still, and the men who had been in dangerous rooms before felt the hair rise on their arms, because they understood something that Vincent had not yet grasped. This was not a threat. This was a notification. What Vincent did not know was that Bumpy had come to that meeting with 3 years of carefully constructed evidence, a network of turned informants reaching into the heart of Torino's organization, compromised photographs that could destroy Vincent's standing with the Chicago families, and the full knowledge and sanction of the old Italian families, who had grown quietly tired of Vincent's instability and ego. He had also come with something that Vincent had gifted him without realizing it, a justification, because in the world Bumpy operated in, publicly insulting a man's mother was not just a social transgression. It was a release. It freed anyone who chose to respond from any obligation of restraint. And Bumpy had been waiting for exactly this kind of release for 3 years. The story of what Bumpy had on Vincent Torino begins 3 years before that night at Ralph's restaurant. It begins with a young man named David Williams, 23 years old, a graduate of Columbia University's journalism program. Ambitious, idealistic, the kind of young man who believed that truth, properly documented and placed in front of the public, could change the world. This particular recording might be of interest to several people. Bumpy continued. The FBI, for instance, have been very curious about your dock operations, something about skimming money from union pension funds. And then there's District Attorney Morrison. He's been looking for evidence of corruption in the sanitation department. He reached into his briefcase and extracted a thick manila envelope. From it, he removed a series of photographs and spread them across the poker table like a man dealing cards. The first showed Vincent meeting with known Soviet agents at the docks. The second showed him accepting an envelope of cash in the basement of a restaurant that didn't exist on any official register. The third was more personal, significantly more personal. And the fourth made Vincent's face change in a way that no threat, no gun, no raised fist had ever managed to achieve. It made him look small. "While you've been running your mouth about respect," Bumpy said, gathering the photographs with the calm efficiency of a man completing a routine task, "I've been busy earning it." He placed the photographs back in the envelope. He closed the briefcase. He stood and straightened his suit. And then he said the thing that nobody in the room had been expecting. "I'm not going to kill you, Vincent." The silence that followed was the loudest thing anyone in that room had ever heard. "Death is too quick," Bumpy said. "Too final. No lesson in it." He picked up the envelope and extended it toward Vincent. "You're going to take this. You're going to go home tonight and look at everything in this folder. Every crime, every dirty deal, every proof of exactly what kind of man you really are." Vincent's hand was shaking as he took the envelope. "Tomorrow morning, you're going to receive a visitor, someone you know very well, and that visitor is going to tell you exactly what comes next." He walked to the door. He paused and turned back one final time. His expression was not triumphant, not angry. It was the expression of a man who has completed a difficult piece of work and is satisfied with the result. "Oh, and Vincent," he said, "tell me something. How's your nephew? Little Anthony, the one at the private school on the Upper East Side. He's a good kid, smart. You should make sure he has good role models." And then he walked out of Ralph's restaurant and into the Harlem night, leaving behind 5 men who were only now beginning to understand the full dimensions of what they had just witnessed. Vincent Torino did not sleep that night. He sat in his study with the envelope open on his desk and went through every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence that Bumpy Johnson had assembled. It took him 3 hours. By the time he finished, the sky was starting to lighten, and Vincent Torino was a different man, not a better man, not a wiser man. Simply a man who understood, for the first time in his life, that he had been completely outplayed. The visitor arrived at 9 in the morning. Vincent watched through the curtains as a black Cadillac pulled into his driveway, and a single figure stepped out. Tall, impeccably dressed, carrying a leather briefcase. A face Vincent had been looking across dinner tables at for 15 years. His brother-in-law, Marcus. The betrayal hit him like something physical. Marcus wasn't just family. He was Vincent's most trusted lieutenant, the keeper of every dark secret. If Marcus was here on Bumpy's behalf, the infiltration of his organization went deeper than anything Vincent had imagined. They sat in Vincent's study, and Marcus opened his briefcase, and what came out was the final chapter of the story of Vincent Torino's power. 3 years of documentation, not just of his crimes, though those were comprehensive and devastating, but of something Vincent had protected his entire life, the truth about his relationship with his sister Maria. Letters in Vincent's own handwriting, spanning 2 decades, documenting an obsession his sister had never known about, a psychological possession that had shaped every decision he had ever made. "Maria doesn't know about these," Marcus said, his voice very quiet. "She doesn't know what you really are. She doesn't know about the men you had beaten for the crime of showing interest in her. She doesn't know about the surveillance you maintained over her life for 20 years, and she is going to find out." Vincent opened his mouth. "You are going to write a confession." Marcus said. "A complete one, everything, and then you are going to disappear. There is a freighter leaving for Buenos Aires in 2 hours. You will be on it. Because if you are still in this city by tomorrow morning, everything in this folder goes to the newspapers, to the FBI, to the Chicago families, and to Maria." The confession took 40 minutes to write. The car to the docks was already waiting. Vincent Torino left New York City on a gray October morning with 2 suitcases, a forged passport, and the weight of a life spent building power through the humiliation of others. He believed he was escaping. He was wrong. 6 months after his arrival in Buenos Aires, Vincent had established a modest life in the suburbs, telling himself that the distance of an ocean and the cover of a new identity would put him beyond Bumpy Johnson's reach. He had been telling himself this story long enough that he had almost started to believe it. The knock came on a Tuesday morning. 3 sharp raps, deliberate, unhurried. Vincent opened the door. Bumpy Johnson was standing on his doorstep in a perfectly tailored suit, looking like a man who had stopped by for a social visit. "Hello, Vincent," Bumpy said. "Beautiful morning, isn't it? Mind if I come in?" What followed in that sparse apartment was the final act of a judgment 3 years in the making. Bumpy had been watching Vincent for 6 months. Every Tuesday walk to the newsstand. Every Thursday lunch at the Italian restaurant on Corrientes Avenue. Every Sunday mass at the cathedral. Every new crime. Because Vincent, removed from his territory and his power structure, had not discovered some better version of himself. He had simply found new victims. Younger ones. The manila envelope Bumpy placed on the coffee table contained photographs that made the financial crimes and the Soviet contacts seem almost irrelevant. Vincent had been using his offshore money to engage with human trafficking networks operating out of Argentina. There were photographs. There were recordings. There was a recording device, the same kind present at the poker table at Ralph's restaurant, containing Vincent's own voice discussing prices and ages and shipping routes. "This meeting isn't a negotiation," Bumpy said. "It's not even a confrontation. It's a funeral." Through the window, Vincent could see them. Black cars, men in dark suits at every exit, local law enforcement prepared for this moment. "You made one fundamental mistake," Bumpy said. "You thought this was about the insult at the poker table. It was never about that. That was a notification. This is the consequence." The door came off its hinges as the police entered. Vincent Torino was handcuffed in the sparse apartment where he had thought he was safe. As they pulled him toward the door, he heard Bumpy Johnson's voice one final time. "My mother always told me that evil destroys itself, eventually. All you have to do is be patient enough to watch it happen." The trial was not a long one. The evidence was comprehensive. The witnesses were credible. The recordings were admissible. Vincent Torino was convicted of human trafficking and multiple related charges and sentenced to 20 years in an Argentine maximum security prison. His name made no headlines in New York. The newspapers that had once reported on the power of the Torino family ran nothing. The criminal families he had served sent no lawyers. His political connections quietly distanced themselves. The erasure was complete. What nobody in the official record ever noted was the role that Bumpy Johnson had played. The federal case had been built on evidence that arrived from anonymous sources. The Argentine law enforcement cooperation had been facilitated through channels that no official report ever traced back to Harlem. The network of informants that had made the entire operation possible was never identified in any public document. Bumpy Johnson had delivered justice so cleanly, so completely, so invisibly, that the man who had engineered every piece of it remained entirely out of the official story. That was the point. If you left fingerprints, you could be countered. If you left no fingerprints, you became something else entirely. Something that couldn't be fought or bargained with or bought. You became an inevitability. Vincent Torino died in that Argentine prison 10 years after his conviction. Alone, forgotten, the newspapers ran nothing. Not a single obituary appeared in any publication in any city where he had once commanded fear and respect. The criminal underworld had moved on. His name had become, if it was used at all, a cautionary reference, a shorthand for a specific kind of fatal miscalculation, the kind that happens when a man mistakes his position for his character, the kind that happens when a man decides to insult the wrong person's mother on a Tuesday night in a private back room in East Harlem. 6 weeks after Vincent Torino's arrest in Buenos Aires, a single black rose was delivered to the grave of David Williams, the young journalist whose death had set everything in motion. No card, no message, no identification. Just the flower and what it communicated to anyone who knew enough to understand the gesture. The debt had been paid. The work had been finished. The trafficking networks David had been investigating when he died were dismantled as part of the Argentine prosecution. The financial connections he had been tracing were exposed. The people protected by Vincent's corruption were exposed. David Williams had gotten his story. It had just taken a little longer than he planned. There is a story that circulated in Harlem for years after these events. A young man who worked in Bumpy's organization came to him with a question. He had watched Torino's kind of power dismantled completely, systematically, without a single shot being fired, by a man who had sat perfectly still while insults rained down on him and simply smiled. The young man wanted to know how. How do you maintain that kind of patience for 3 years? How do you sit across from someone insulting your mother and feel no anger? Bumpy was quiet for a long moment before he answered. The anger was there, he said. Don't mistake the stillness for the absence of fire. The fire was always there, but fire, if you let it run free, burns your own house down as fast as it burns everything else. The art is not in having no fire. The art is in knowing exactly when to open the door and let it out, and where to point it. He looked at the young man for a long moment. Vincent thought he was humiliating me that night. He thought my silence was weakness. What he couldn't see was that every word he said was a gift. Every insult, every boast, every detail he revealed about his operation in that room, it was all material, it was all information. A man who is performing power is always showing you his hand. He can't help it, because the performance requires an audience, and the audience has eyes. The young man thought about this. But what about the patience? 3 years. Bumpy smiled, the same smile that had been in the room at Ralph's restaurant. How long did they keep your people down? He said. How many years, how many generations of patience was demanded from people who had done nothing to deserve it? 3 years is nothing. 3 years is a Tuesday afternoon. The scholarship fund created from the assets seized in connection with Vincent Torino's conviction became one of the most quietly influential journalism programs in the northeastern United States. Young reporters trained there were taught something most journalism schools of the era did not emphasize. They were taught that the most important stories were the ones the powerful did not want told. That truth was not merely something that happened. It was something that had to be found, documented, protected, and delivered. Some of them, years into their careers, would discover that the anonymous funding behind their education traced back to a network of businesses in Harlem. And some of those who discovered this would understand, for the first time, what it meant that a man they had been taught to think of as a criminal had spent the last years of his life ensuring that the work his nephew had been doing when he was killed would continue. That was the real legacy of what happened to Vincent Torino. Not the conviction, not the prison sentence, not the absence of an obituary. The real legacy was the opposite of everything Torino had represented. Where Torino had silenced a young man trying to tell the truth, Bumpy Johnson had created a system ensuring that truth-tellers would keep coming. The story of Vincent Torino and Bumpy Johnson is about the nature of two fundamentally different understandings of power. Vincent Torino understood power as something you extracted from the world, something you accumulated through fear, through position, through the brutal mathematics of who had more muscle and more money and more willingness to hurt people. Power as a zero-sum game. If someone else had respect, yours was diminished. The only way to maintain it was constant aggression, constant humiliation of anyone who might represent a threat. Bumpy Johnson understood power differently. He understood it as something you built, something that grew through the loyalty of people who chose to follow you rather than people who were afraid not to. He had paid rent for families who couldn't make it. He had sent kids to school who otherwise would have ended up on corners. He had protected the community that had produced him with the same fierce intelligence he brought to every other operation. And in doing so, he had created something that Vincent's kind of power could never create. A network of people who would do anything for him, not because they were afraid, but because they genuinely believed in what he represented. Fear-based power is borrowed. You hold it only as long as the people afraid of you remain afraid of you. The moment the fear cracks, the power cracks with it, and there is nothing underneath it. No foundation, no loyalty, no genuine respect, just the empty space where the fear used to be. Earned power is owned, not borrowed. It lives in the choices of the people who choose to follow you. It persists even when you're not in the room. It extends itself across distances and through time, without requiring your constant presence to maintain it. Bumpy Johnson didn't destroy Vincent Torino. He simply held up a mirror long enough for everyone else to see what was in it. In Harlem, they still tell the story. In the back rooms of certain clubs, among old men who remember the 60s and the particular quality of power that inhabited those streets, the story is told the way that meaningful stories are always told. With respect for the craft of it, with an understanding of what it cost, and with a clear-eyed recognition of the thing that separates a man who builds a legend from a man who merely builds an empire. The empire ends when the man ends. The legend continues as long as there are people who understand what it means. Vincent Torino built an empire. He is gone. No obituary, no legacy. No one who remembers his name with anything other than the faint, dusty curiosity you might feel reading about a footnote in a history you were never part of. Bumpy Johnson built something else entirely, and that is why, 60 years later, we are still telling his story, because some men leave marks on the world that cannot be erased. Not because they were the most powerful, not because they were the most feared, but because they understood something about the difference between power and purpose, between position and character, between the fear you can create and the respect you can earn, that most men who reach for power never figure out. And because, on a Tuesday night in 1961, when a man who had inherited everything sat across a poker table and chose to reach for the cheapest, cruelest weapon available to him, the man across from him simply smiled, picked up a photograph of his mother, and decided, without anger and without hurry, that the debt would be paid in full. It was, it always is, when the right man is doing the collecting.